I'm Amelia Robinson, the Columbus Dispatch's opinion and engagement editor. Welcome to Columbus Conversations. Can people afford to live here? This is the latest in a new town hall series about issues important to this community. Affordable housing definitely falls into that category. Finding housing can be a challenge for most people in Columbus. It's even more complicated for those struggling to make ends meet. We're going to talk up through some solutions to these challenging times in our city and the impact affordability can have on people seeking housing. As always during these talks, you are welcome to join in by submitting questions to our panelists in the Facebook chat. I will get to as many questions as I can. This event is part of the Dispatch's celebration of 150 years of service to Columbus, Central Ohio, and the rest of the state. Support local journalism by subscribing to The Dispatch at dispatch.com/subscribe now. Now I'm going to introduce our great panel. We have Brian E. Higgins. He is the principal of Arch City Development. We have Erin Prosser. She is the City of Columbus's Assistant Director of Housing Strategy. We have Noel Williams of BRED. She's the Vice President and Chair of the Families First and Housing Now. Jennifer Knoll, she's the Principal Planner with the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. We have Dr. Sidney Charles. He is Chief Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity Officer for the Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority. And finally, but not least, we have Ann Bischoff, who is the CEO of Star House. So we're going to get started. And the first question is just the level set. And I'm going to ask you to go first, Ann. What is affordable housing?
So it's essentially housing that folks can afford while also being able to take care of basic needs and withstand unexpected emergency expenses. I know the generally agreed upon definition is housing that costs no more than 30% of someone's income, and this includes utilities. I'll tell you about Star House. We serve young people ages 14 to 24 who are experiencing homelessness and are by and large disconnected from their family, trying to make a go of it on their own. Half were in foster care at some point. Others are LGBTQ and they've been kicked out. And still others have run away from abuse in the home. And at a time when half of all adults ages 30 and under are living back home with their parents, we're serving young adults who simply don't have that safety net. And if you think about it, any of us really need four things to sustain our housing. It's truly affordable housing, a good paying job and the credentials to get and keep that job, good health to get to work every day, and a community of support, which I think is really the most important thing. If someone without a safety net is housed but encounters an emergency, let's say their car breaks down and they can't afford to fix it, they can't get to their low-wage job, they're at risk of losing their job, their housing, and their means of transportation. This is a catch-22 situation that so many members of our community find themselves in. So truly affordable housing enables folks to withstand emergencies and sustain all the pieces of stability simultaneously.
Does anybody else want to add to that?
Yes, I'd like to add, thanks for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I'd like to add that, as many may know, that the mission of the Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority is to provide working through collaborative partnerships to ensure that people have affordable housing and maintain that housing, and sustain neighborhoods, as well as, and this is the piece I want to sort of highlight, is assist people assess needed social services. It's sort of what Ann sort of talked about in terms of providing that support for many of the folks who are part of our who reside in our housing units. And I want to say specifically providing support for people who are members of our community who are veterans, individuals assisting out of the foster care system, as well as individuals with disabilities. But I also want to suggest and highlight that how CMHA defines affordable housing, along with the definition that Ann provided, is that we believe that housing should be available to all. And that's what we see affordable housing, is that everyone has an opportunity to have some place to live.
So I'm relatively new to town. My husband and I have been looking at the real estate market, and believe you me, it is nuts. Like, I know firsthand how crazy it is as somebody who's been looking for a house here. Is it, just going back to the title of the program, can people afford to live here?
So
sure.
I'd like to. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I'd like to address that. So, can people live here? Affordable housing. For bread, that's a relative term. Affordable housing. It depends upon where you are socially, economically. And can people live here? Again, that depends upon where you are. For bread, we're not new to this housing issue. In 2017, we heard from many of our congregants that talked about they could not afford safe, decent housing. So when we're looking at affordable housing, we're looking at a specific population that income levels is $30,000 or less. Those people cannot afford where we are right now in terms of housing. So for that group of people, no, they cannot afford to live here. And that's a life and death situation for us all, not just for them.
I think you're right, and I think that it's important to point out that it's very relative on who you are, and you might be able to say that, hey, I can find affordable housing on my income, but you have to realize it may not be in your preferred community, right? So how do you value that? How do you value school districts? Do you then decide that you want to become house poor because you want to be in maybe a school district that performs better academically? That's a value decision that you can make, and not every community allows for the creation of affordable housing. In many cases, zoning regulations have been weaponized to ensure that you can only build certain types of housing, and then that forces price points because those construction levels are more expensive to build. That of course gets passed on to the user. So, and I think we need only look to CMHA to see how many people are on the Section 8 waiting list right now. 20,000. I mean, so at the very low end of the spectrum, the answer is probably no, or there wouldn't be a waiting list at all for subsidized housing.
Yeah, I'll weigh in. If you take a look at the National Low Income Housing Coalition website, you'll see that in our community, 39% of households are renters, and they're earning a mean wage of $16.99. So affordable rent, if you're using that 30% indicator there, affordable rent is about $833 a month. And I talked to our case managers at Star House who are connecting our young people with housing, and they're telling me that right now rent for a one-bedroom apartment is anywhere from $825 to $1,065. However, there are just far too few options at or below that $833 a month level. And when they do become available, they're snatched up like that. The Affordable Housing Alliance also reported a couple of years ago that for every a unit of affordable housing, there are 3 low-income renters waiting for that housing. And even before the pandemic, 54,000 Franklin County families paid more than half of their income for housing. That's simply not sustainable. It puts people at risk of homelessness and other issues.
I think what compounds on all of this is, we certainly as a regional planning agency will often hear from folks, Central Ohio is still a relatively affordable place to live. And if we're looking at other coastal communities, that may be true. I think what adds urgency to this conversation is the reality that as those communities become less and less affordable, more and more folks are going to be looking to move to areas that are more affordable. Central Ohio is a really attractive place to be. We have a lot of jobs. We have great schools. There's access to healthcare. And climate is another big consideration that is driving folks to places like Central Ohio. The reality is, after so many years of sort of unprecedented growth and not being able to build enough housing to keep up with that growth, we're going to be sort of adding to the existing housing affordability issues for residents who are already here. And so that does start to build upon itself and make our region less affordable if we're not doing some course correcting while we still can.
Now, Daryl McKinley from the Facebook chat, who's watching on Facebook, he had a question about gentrification. What role is gentrification playing? Somebody could talk about gentrification and how you can sort of correct that. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
I'm sorry, say the question.
To some degree.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Brian.
To some degree, gentrification is, I think, desirable, and that may sound controversial, but really, from a public policy standpoint, what we've done is warehouse poor people in the same half dozen neighborhoods around town, and it's not just Columbus. It's happened in every American city, especially as in the post-war era, as we suburbanized. We built the interstate highway system through low-income and minority neighborhoods, and we sort of a social justice component to that as well. But so we have neighborhoods that are overwhelmingly poor. You would want, a neighborhood, it's more desirable to be of a mixed income, so that you have people with diverse incomes who can support local businesses, maybe have some expendable dollars. And so, invariably, I think that's a goal. Unfortunately, a lot of times the real estate pressures that you see will snowball, and you end up displacing too many people in the sense that it becomes a neighborhood of choice, and then there is no economic opportunity for people who maybe have a historic or history in that community. But I think a little bit of economic balance is not a bad thing.
And I think as you look at some of the neighborhoods that are changing, especially in the city of Columbus, and the opportunity that Jennifer mentioned earlier, where we do have some affordability that's naturally occurring in those neighborhoods, and the opportunity now to preserve it and to shore it up as those neighborhoods experience that change. I think the other component of it is to look at protections for our tenants and resources for low-income homeowners that are vulnerable in those neighborhoods to being displaced, and how we give the protections to those folks to be able to stay in those communities as that change and transition occurs.
So Morphic kind of projects by the time we reach 2050 that there's going to be 3 million residents in the greater Columbus area. What is the ideal mix of available housing for this region, and where are you going to put all those people?
I'll start with that. I think that's a great question. And yes, we do. We're pretty bullish on that 3 million by 2050 number. Even with changes like we've experienced in the last couple of years, our model can anticipate those and sort of levels out over time to the point that we are pretty confident that 3 million people by 2050 is realistic. I think another important thing to mention is not only is the region growing, but our population is changing too. We're becoming more diverse. And so as we grow and become more diverse, our needs and preferences as a community are going to change as well and become more diverse. And so one of the things that we looked at with the regional housing strategy, which is an effort that we released last year, was looking at how we can leverage housing as a platform for equitable growth. And if we're truly going to leverage housing as a platform for equitable growth, then it's really important that we're thinking about all types of housing at all housing price points. And so we really need an ideal mix of both single family and multifamily homes for renters and for homeowners, homes that can accommodate a wide range of abilities, homes that can accommodate varying household sizes too. And then while we're at it, it's really important to think about housing in context. So the ideal mix of housing would also have neighborhoods that have sidewalks and access to transit, so that residents are able to get safely to the places that they're going, whether that's jobs or school or shopping. So we consider all of those things when we're talking about housing truly as a platform for equitable growth.
And I'd add that our community lost about 20,000 homes that rented for under $900 a month from 2017 to 2019. If you look at the population of the city of Whitehall, that's about the same. as their population, an entire city of loss of housing units at that range. So to Jennifer's point, we really need truly affordable housing options for every household. Let's take a look at the projected income brackets for our community and create mixed income affordable housing that's aligned with those figures. And I know folks in our community are working on that, and I'm certainly encouraged by that. We also need to create at least 14,000 units per year just to keep up with population growth. And I think I think there's a lot of opportunity for us here to add additional units. And I was looking up this data here. It says we fell short of that goal for 14,000 units by having only 11,800 homes created in the last year. So our community's 10-year goal, I know, is to raise $450 million for affordable housing, and we had only raised $226 million by last year. This is really promising. I know a lot of hands are on deck to raise more funds to ensure that we meet that goal, and I'm really hopeful with public-private partnerships that we will get there.
And I think this also speaks
Anne's 100%.
Oh, sorry, Brian. I think this also speaks to the issue of how regional this conversation has to be. There are 43 separate jurisdictions just in Franklin County, and each of those jurisdictions is going to need to participate in this conversation, and we're going to all need to come together for a regional strategy for that growth if we're going to end up being an equitable region where there are opportunities for families across our region. And that's really going to be a question over the next few years of how we all come together is going to determine how we end up growing in the coming years and whether or not we remain a livable, equitable region. And I think that's going to be the question that we need to talk about very regionally and not just amongst specific jurisdictions.
That's right. Housing for low-income folks especially needs to have nearby, even on-site access to resources, on-site jobs, education, healthcare, therapy, and community engagement opportunities that will really give them a leg up to long-term stability, which I know is what our community is going for, that surefire level of housing stability for everyone in our community.
We have a question from Facebook. Her last name is Parker. She says, instead of trying to create more low-income housing development areas, why not put in place a step-up program that is inclusive for all people who have low-income housing or Section 8 in order to make room for those in need of assisted government housing and or other government housing programs? So how about a sort of step-up program? I'm not sure what she means by step-up program. Is anybody familiar with?
I'm not sure what she's talking about with the step-up. If she could add clarification in the chat, that would be helpful. I can talk about what we're doing in Franklinton in partnership with CMHA and Finance Fund. We have 62 units. We took an old Motel 6 and converted those units into efficiency apartments. And we also have on-site jobs in partnership with social enterprise partners. So young people, emerging adults, college-age kids have immediate access to those job opportunities and training. There's also on-site therapy, healthcare, mental health and addiction services, and opportunities for young people to gain connections in their community through mentoring and participating in Franklinton organizations like Franklinton CycleWorks and more.
I'm sorry, she offered a clarification too. She's asking about help with people in Section 8 and low income with buying a home of their own, like basically rent to own or programs like that.
Well, I'd like to add that, Anne kind of hit on, she talked about some of the partnerships that we have with her organization. But I think the other piece that to that question is that we have to have more partnerships. We have to be able to all come together to make sure that we are addressing this lack or this limited housing stock within our Columbus and greater Columbus area. One of the things that strategic goal of the Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority is that we plan to develop and or acquire over 500 units a year for the next 5 years so we can have affordable housing for our constituents within our region. And with that, I think that if I do the numbers correct, I think that's going to be about 15 100 individuals who will, or families will have a place to stay. But that's only going to happen unless we have more partnerships. And in addition to the program, the Step Up program, I think more of these sort of, I don't want to say wraparound services, but providing supportive services for residents to be able to access those programs, not necessarily provide those services for the residents, but connect them to community agencies through like our resident initiatives department. We have partnerships across the city where we're able to connect our residents to those various types of programs so they can be sustained or be stabilized, or in some cases move up or move out, as they say.
So I would like to say something. I think all of that is great. But when we're looking at this, we've got to look at the policies that the city has or is putting in place. So gentrification is happening all over the community. And just last week, well, the week of December 6th, the city had its latest hearing on revising the tax abatement policy. If the proposal from that hearing passes, Brad believes that we can expect to see continued gentrification. So we see, when we look around this city, let's be honest, we see expensive condos and apartments being built, massive. People making less than 30,000 a year. Those people, I'm talking about people that work as child care providers, restaurant workers, janitorial staff. They need housing that they can afford. Rent at about 600 or less per month. You can't find that from what you guys have said. You can't find that in Columbus anywhere. And if we do, it's probably, if they do, it's probably run down and it's run by a slumlord. And so that's why Bread has been pushing the city for a plan. Bread has a plan, one that we continue to ask Mayor Ginther to meet with us because we believe the plan we are pushing for and that we're putting out is one that will create affordable housing for not only the sector of people you're talking about, but as well as for the restaurant workers, janitorial staff. So we've got to look at the city's policy. And what Morpsey did, they did a great thing when they did their study and they called together the community. There were many recommendations made. It would be great to see those implemented.
When we say affordable housing, how much is the housing cost? How much is the house itself, or how much is the rent in dollars? Because a lot of times we throw around affordable housing, and I want to make sure we're all talking about affordable housing.
And see, that's why I say it's a relative term. It depends upon where you are in the community. We hear from developers when we're talking about the city and Bread. Shayla Favors, I'm sorry, forgive me, Shayla Favors, City Council Member Favors, made a commitment to Bread. And she has a moral obligation to hold to that. So when we're talking about affordable housing, we're talking about that group that earns $30,000 or less. Some of the people that CMHA have as clients. But we're talking about that sector. So affordable housing for Bread is that group.
How much money does a house cost? Is it $150,000? Is it, how much is the house? Is it $79,000?
So we've got some research that shows that increasingly the cost of a house is on the rise. I think the Dispatch just published recently, the median cost for a house was around $260,000 just earlier this year. And so that's certainly on the rise. When we talk about affordable housing, oftentimes what we're talking about is relative to area median income. And so if you're an individual in Franklin County, the area median income is around $58,000. So if you were to try to spend 30% of your income on housing costs, that would require you to spend fewer than $1,500 a month, not only on rent or mortgage, but also taxes and utilities, right? And that's at AMI. When we look at affordable housing, we're then looking at, as Noel has said, 30% of area median income, which is a fraction of that, all the way up to 120%, right? So there's a spectrum on which affordable housing may fall. What we're finding is that within the market, if the median sales price is $269,000, we're finding that increasingly you could still be earning well above the area median income and struggling to pay housing expenses at 30%. And so the reality is, when it comes to creating affordable housing for those at lower incomes, natural market forces are not going to make that play out. It's going to require support, public dollars, public-private partnerships. It's going to require policies as well, all coalescing around this shared understanding that we need to support the construction of new housing for those, especially those very vulnerable, very low-income households.
So we look at places like San Francisco, and you look at like Austin, where our friend Joe, who's running things behind the scenes from, things are out of control with housing prices. How close is Columbus to that point where it's going to be another San Francisco or Austin? Or
So Columbus right now is the second most economically segregated community in the nation. And you're absolutely right. When you look at a place like San Francisco, from what I'm being told or from what I hear, the homeless population there is increasing. And so if we're not concerned and we don't take action now, then that will be Columbus. And when we think about it, we're in a pandemic and people are dying. These people need housing. And what we've learned about COVID, it knows no boundary. It can touch us all. Why would we want those people, more people on the street, more people not in safe, decent housing? Developers, I agree. It must be a partnership. There are many solutions on the table, but the developers have to focus on people, not so much their profits. They've got to come to the table, and they must be willing to come to the table and add to it, and not only houses that are housing that is 200,000 or above.
I'd like to add, not necessarily to the question about what's happening in Austin and San Francisco, but I think a potential solution could be, and one of the things that we've been doing at CMHA is we've been actively recruiting landlords or property owners to participate in our incentive program to get more landlords to participate in the voucher program to offer those affordable housing options for residents. So we talk about gentrification. So as we do that, we get those landlords or those developers to make sure that they are partnering with us so they can participate in that process. And I know that may sound very, I want to be an optimist in this because that's part of what we're trying to do is come up with solutions. But that is one particular avenue in which we can be able to at least begin to put a dent into this larger problem.
Yeah, I'll be an optimist with Sydney, and I think if we can draw inspiration from Donato's Pizza, where they say every piece is important, I think every housing unit is important. And I'll put a call to action to landlords and housing developers. If you have one unit or 100 housing units, let somebody know. I encourage you to reach out to CMHA. Let them know if you have a unit to spare. Reach out to rentormentor.net. Let them know, and also Home for Families, and I could go on and on. If you're interested in partnering with StarHouse to provide housing for college-age youth, you can reach out to housing@starhouse.us. No unit is too few. Any units you have, they're needed. We have to meet that 14,000 a year goal.
So Anthony actually, talking about solutions, Anthony actually brings up an important point. He's talking about affordable housing and seniors. He says that he's talking about the Hannah, and he says he was talking to a group of seniors who want to move from their larger homes to smaller ones, but they can't find affordable houses. That's one issue. And also, you have seniors in areas where the neighborhood is changing and they can't keep up with those changes because of fixed income and so forth. What is being done to help seniors stay in their homes or find more suitable housing?
Definitely, I think a multifaceted issue. One way that MORPC works to assist seniors and other income eligible households in the community is through its home weatherization and home repair programs. These are two really critical programs that serve households within Franklin County. And Columbus has a program similarly for its residents. But I think this is serving really important roles for our residents, and especially for older adults. We know that not only do many of them want to be maybe in smaller homes, oftentimes it's a matter of their existing home is not accessible for them. If they utilize a mobility device, or if their bedroom's upstairs, retrofits can be done to those homes that would allow them to remain in their home. It's a more cost-effective solution. Oftentimes, it's also matching their preference to their desire to remain in their home or in their community. And so it's a win-win. These are really popular programs. There's always a need for more resources so we can serve more households, but these have a lot of benefits and they're an important way of helping, especially older residents, to remain in their homes.
And I think looking at just the diversity of housing typologies, I mean, the largest age group in Central Ohio is turning 30 in 2021, and they're headed into that home buying age. And as they look for kind of their first home, it tends to be in that same market with our seniors that are looking to downsize. And so as we need to expand that, not only just the unit count, but the diversity of units that we have available in Central Ohio so that we can accommodate those folks that are entering the housing market and those that are looking to downsize as well.
So Aaron, since you just started talking, I'll leave it on you. You just got hired into your new position as the Director for Housing Strategies. What have you been up to? And there was $50 million on the table for affordable housing. How do you plan on using that? Can you talk a little bit about what's going to happen with that money?
Sure. So yeah, the position was created this year really with the intention for the city of Columbus to take a very strategic look at housing. And we know that housing crosses a lot of our different departments. And as I mentioned earlier, it also crosses a lot of different jurisdictions, and really trying to understand how the city can lead in that space and really focusing on affordability, but also just bringing a regional conversation to the table. And I think the voters approved a housing bond in 2018 that was $50 million. Those dollars have been committed all to affordable housing projects. They will leverage, that money will leverage about 1,300 units across the city of Columbus for those earning below 80% of the area median income, with a lot of our affordable housing partners and projects that they worked on throughout the community. That was certainly really effective and important intentional infusion of affordability that we've had the last few years. And as we continue to grow, and as you mentioned earlier, as we continue to have a population growth, we're going to have to be very intentional about how we build in that affordability. As Jennifer said earlier, the market itself is not going to provide that for us. And so we are all going to have to create those partnerships, as Dr. Childs mentioned, to facilitate the construction of that affordability. And again, across the entire region. I think we're going to need to look at strategies, as I mentioned, around preservation, really looking at programs that other cities have instituted around naturally occurring affordable housing and really locking that into our systems, especially in those high opportunity, high transition neighborhoods. And again, I think we're going to need to include, I think we need to make sure that there's equitable access to housing, that families are able to choose where they want to live and in what types of units they want to live. And again, without needing to exceed that 30% of their income. I think that's going to be the trick for all of us to come together and really facilitate that broader conversation, but certainly looking across the systems within the city of Columbus, and then really looking at our partners throughout the community, both in the affordable housing development community, but also just our citizens and stakeholders as well. I think what gives me optimism is that we're having this conversation in Columbus, and we're taking this moment to really think through what the impacts of that population growth are going to be, and the decisions we make in the next 10 years will determine who we become. And we can look at cases where there wasn't early intervention and there wasn't deliberate, intentional infusion of affordability into those communities. And once that is off the table, it's really hard to reel it back. And we are having this conversation at a time I think one of the first questions you asked is, really, can people afford to live here? And I think right now in our community, it depends on where you are in that income spectrum as to how you would answer that question. And I think where we see other cities that haven't managed that and haven't taken that heed of where we're seeing that kind of the initial impacts affecting our most vulnerable families and individuals, when they didn't take heed of those indications, is where you saw kind of the where they are now trying to reel that back. And I think where we are in Central Ohio is this incredible opportunity to shift gears and do things differently in heading out of the 2020s and really thinking differently about how we do everything. And I think that's really what my role is here, is to figure out how we shift gears, right? How do we shift from being the city that I grew up in Columbus, and how do we really turn into a place where we are built for that future and built for equity and built for affordability. And it's going to take changing our systems. It's going to take, again, a regional conversation amongst all the jurisdictions. And that's really what we get to do over the next few years. And I'm optimistic about where we are as a community having that conversation compared to where some of our peer cities were, and where we have the opportunity to make a different path for ourselves.
On the same line, what is you said equity, like what does the equitable city look like as far as like housing mix and availability to people? What does that look like, do you think?
I mean, I think you're looking at a housing ecosystem that's really supportive of our most vulnerable families and making sure that they have safe and stable housing across the region. And then I think we need a diversity of housing types and making sure that we are looking across all of our communities and making sure that we have opportunities for different price points, different types of housing, different styles based on where your needs are, not just in your income brackets, but, as we mentioned earlier, age and where you are in your family lifetime and all of those different components. We've in the 20th century, we leaned really heavy into single family housing, and that was really what zoning did in a lot of communities, was really create a really big inventory of that type of housing. As we look into the 21st century, we're going to need to think differently about how housing typologies lay out across our communities.
Does anybody else want to jump into that? Anybody else have any thoughts on equitability and housing?
I would just add that I think as we're talking about equity, and yes to everything Erin said, I think we also need to recognize that we have some intentional policies and programs that over time have made our communities rather inequitable. And that's particularly for households of color. And we continue to see the same statistics play out time over time. So we can look at a map of our communities, and oftentimes where you live, your zip code is most indicative of your future outcomes, whether that's your health or your household income, a number of other factors, your access to opportunity. All that can be determined by where you live. And we can look at a map in Columbus. We can tend to look to neighborhoods east of I-71, south of I-70, and see that these are neighborhoods that for decades have experienced disinvestment, discrimination in the market, and oftentimes have a higher proportion of households of color. And so these impacts compound, and they have lasting effects in terms of generational wealth building, in terms of access to home loans or mortgages in order to move. And so these are all issues that, as we're considering what an equitable city and equitable region looks like, we have to be very intentional in facing and addressing.
And I also like to add that, one of the, I guess if we looked at solutions, is that many cities many areas within the Columbus area have enacted ordinances or laws or legislation that prevents, in terms of this, what an equitable city would look like. They've put together legislation that has prevented income discrimination. And so that, if we have that in place, in addition to the disparities that may be happening, but if folks want to come into certain areas and they want to participate in a voucher program, and then that individual we don't want that individual to be discriminated against because they're participating in that process.
And so for me, when we're talking about this, what it comes down to is all of this, as in the words of Martin, a beloved community. And this is a matter of political will. And it's a matter of life and death. A homeless man literally froze to death outside last year. And so for us, this is not only people, affluent people, but it is people, I'm going to keep saying this, $30,000 or less. When we're looking at building housing, when we're looking at safe, affordable, decent housing, we must also consider other options. Maybe rent control can possibly be an option in some of these situations.
So Philip, Phil just asked a question on Facebook. What are some of the things that average citizens can do to help the problem get better? So what can people actually do to help?
When somebody comes to your neighborhood and wants to build dense multifamily housing, don't protest them, because you actually can build, some greater economies of scale into housing like that. Columbus is incredibly low dense as a community compared to a lot of our peer cities. It didn't used to be that way. If you look at our population demographics, even in 1950, let alone 1930, we had a lot more people living in the same geographic footprint than we do today. And some of that is because household family sizes declined over time. But some of it is because density became a dirty word, I think, during suburbanization. And, people get these ideas of high density equals crime, equals problems. And that's not the case. But, to allow, you can be more cost effective to build in the built environment instead of constantly building single family infill homes in some of our neighborhoods. And, it doesn't even have to be crazy dense, right? It could be 2 units, it could be 4 units, it could be something though that allows more people to be using the same services, the same existing utilities, the same you're being near the same job centers, the same bus routes, all that kind of stuff. But yet you see time and time again, people get very nervous and concerned about density.
I would add that if they're a property owner and they have additional properties that they sort of maintain, they can participate in our housing voucher program, where we will help them be able to connect and put folks in their units that are that we help with as part of being part of CMHA. So if you're in that, you can participate in our voucher program, and we'll train you, we'll get you set up, and then you'll be able to help address the program, the situation from their point of view. It's a small way to do it, but it's an impactful way to make that happen. So I encourage them to go to CMHA.com, look at our website, and you can learn all about the housing voucher program.
Are you going to add something, Aaron? Okay.
I'd like to add something, if I could, about what folks can do to pitch in. Certainly provide units if you have those available. Like Sydney was talking about, at Star House, we partner with OSU on a range of research. And one of the findings that pops up in all the studies is the power of relationships. It's one of the greatest predictors of exiting homelessness. And so I would encourage folks to think about opportunities to mentor with different agencies, and volunteer, give back, serve within the warehouses of various organizations, and look for their volunteer opportunities.
Now, speaking of builders, and Brian, you're the builder in the group here. What could builders do to help the situation? What are they doing to help the affordable housing issue in Columbus?
I think Ann touched on this eloquently earlier, and that is they're simply not building enough units, and it's not a one-time issue. This has been going on for years and years, and so what it does is exacerbates supply-demand issues, right? We continue to see. We saw the census data come out. We had growth in population. We're over 900,000 people in the city of Columbus. The region continues to grow, but if we're underbuilding housing, that means that the housing that does get built or that does already exist, it's going to continue to increase in price, right? So because there's just pressure, very basic supply demand issues. If we were exceeding the number of houses that is projected, then you'd see really an attrition. And the higher end housing might be new, and then the housing that's maybe 5 to 10 years old would be discounted a little until you work your way down sort of the housing chain, and you'll see more affordable housing in older product and perhaps older neighborhoods. So there's a cause and effect kind of thing that occurs just in the lifespan of homes. I think there's a challenge. We hear about supply issues and supply chain issues and labor, and all those things are real. A building that I had just recently put out to bid. I built a very similar building. It's just wrapping up now, but we bid that 18 months ago, and prices have increased by 25%. And so, at the end of the day, the bank doesn't care about those things. They're not going to give you a loan unless you meet certain thresholds. Investors don't care. So there's, that margin has become even narrower. Things like the city's tax abatement program are very helpful in creating an opportunity for affordability. But I think there needs to be greater thought and partnership about how we can work together. What can we do to diminish risk, to increase affordability? Is it working through the land bank maybe, or trying to find some sort of hybrid public-private model? I think that would be an encouraging thing. Another thing to consider, and I know the city is doing this now, is revisiting the zoning code. There are a lot of times where we get caught up in mandatory minimum parking requirements. So, if you end up building a parking garage, that's a very expensive endeavor that does not make any money. It loses money as part of your development deal, which then makes it harder and harder to build affordable housing. I think you see a lot of peer cities have reduced or eliminated parking requirements in many cases. I think that we do something like that. We really would need to consider investing heavily in public transit. And I know there's a lot of talk about high-capacity transit corridors and different things, but I think they go hand in hand because, at the end of the day, I think developers are willing to take a certain amount of risk, but at the same time, there needs to be an opportunity to facilitate. How are you going to get to your jobs if you are, in fact, carless? And Columbus has been built around the automobile, and so it's sort of balancing all these things at once. I do think there's an opportunity for the development community to partner in all these endeavors to really help promote greater affordability.
And one of the priorities that emerged from our work on the regional housing strategy is a real interest among the partners in seeing support for pilot projects or just really innovative development models. And Brian touched on some of the real challenges that developers are facing right now with regard to materials costs, and labor shortages. It may be a good time for us to be thinking outside the traditional box in terms of the materials that are being used for development, the approach that's being taken to constructing new homes. And I think if we as a community can be supportive of these innovations and help to embrace them, that might create an environment that really helps for them to be successful.
Also, I agree. But what about rehabbing some of the old hotels? Not only that, there's the American Rescue dollars, using some of those funds to offset some of the expenses that the developers have.
Does anybody else have any ideas about what developers can do?
One thing I'll say, and kind of piggybacking on Dr. Childs mentioned earlier, just innovative partnerships, and where our affordable housing developers who typically are utilizing low-income housing tax credits to build their projects and to really build in that affordability, and where we've got our market rate developers and that creation of some of the partnerships that are starting to form between those two groups brings the opportunity for those real mixed income communities. There's an example in Franklinton between an affordable housing developer and a market rate developer, and the opportunity to come together on a project and build in that affordability in a high opportunity neighborhood while also building in that market rate product as well. And I think we'll see more of that in the coming years as some of the flexibility and partnerships are built between those two developers in our community.
Now, switching gears a little bit, there's probably people out there who are struggling right now with their mortgages or rent. Can we talk a little bit about programs that can help people who are currently having a difficult time?
Absolutely. There are more services than ever right now, thanks partially to the emergency rental assistance through the stimulus package. This assistance, which is in the millions in Central Ohio, thanks to the distribution of Franklin County and the city, it covers past due rent, mortgage payments, and first month's rent. And so I'm very encouraged by that. And I hope that we can learn from the stimulus and continue this on to a greater degree beyond the pandemic. You can visit rentful614.com again, rentful614.com to learn more about these supports for tenants and for landlords as well. I'd also add there's a new program called Neighbor Relief. It's a newer program that provides support with utilities, phone bills, and other bills. And then the Columbus Foundation has a program called Gifts of Kindness that helps cover emergency expenses, like a car repair so that you can get to work and pay for your rent. It really is intended to help people keep their housing. At Star House, we're fortunate to have a housing flex fund thanks to Anthem that covers a rent deposit in the first month's rent as well. So very encouraged by increasing assistance for people in need in our community.
And that also speaks to the larger question about providing those sort of supportive services for residents. At CMHA, we have a department called Residents Initiative. And in that program, they have developed strong partnerships with community agencies that direct students or direct residents to social services. And in addition to that, to the direct question of what are we doing to prevent the housing, loss of housing, is that we fund an eviction prevention fund where our residents can participate in order to help offset any challenges that they may have related to losing housing.
So we're coming up to the end of our program. We got a couple more minutes. I just wanted to talk a little bit about things that might give you guys hope that we're not going to be in a situation where some of the cities are that, have, skyrocketing costs for living. Are there things that give you hope that Columbus has an opportunity to turn this whole thing around?
Yes, what gives Brad hope is Mayor Ginther meeting with Brad and looking at the long-term plan that Brad has laid out, that's evidence-based, that's working in other cities.
I'm hopeful because, as I mentioned earlier, one part of the conversation is that we are on target to offer 500 new units every year for the next 5 years. That is going to be a significant impact on this issue within our community, within Central Ohio. I'm also hopeful because we are having this conversation. We are talking about this and more people are talking about it. And I think as we continue to keep this issue at the forefront, we will continue to bring all these creative, smart individuals to the table to address this problem because we can do that. I think also, I mentioned earlier that communities are passing income discrimination legislation, anti-discrimination legislation that makes sure that that doesn't happen. That's hopeful. If more communities do that, I think we can, again, put a dent into this issue. And then I think lastly, we didn't talk about this, and I know this is still out there, but the I'm encouraged about what may be offered in the Build Back Better legislation, that if it moves forward the way we think it might, that will infuse a significant amount of dollars in our community to address this issue. So a couple of things as we think about this going forward, as again, I'm an eternal optimist. I think we can do this. We've got smart, intelligent people who are passionate about this and are committed about providing for housing for all. And so I'll end there.
I think that we have to care about it. And the reality is not everybody does. This doesn't, until very recently, this hasn't been a discussion that has transcended, the business community and other parts of our community. But the reality is this: if we continue to go down this path where we get farther and farther away from having a reasonable amount of affordable housing, then this will eventually impact the economic growth of Central Ohio, because you won't have businesses that want to either expand or relocate to Central Ohio if their employees can't find reasonable housing. And that's at the basic level, that's it. And that will dry up the economy very quickly. And, you've seen this happen in other communities. And I think, we already have enough of a competitive disadvantage, frankly, being, in the snow belt and some other things. We're not in the mountains of like Denver. We're not in the warm weather like Austin or Charlotte. We have some of those challenges that are never going to go away. We're never on the ocean. So we already have to overcome that. We have to overcome some of the other, sort of the greater population loss that's going on in the state of Ohio and some of the other policy issues. So, if the city and the business community doesn't address this, then they can ensure that this wonderful magic carpet ride we've been on as a community is not going to last in perpetuity.
Anybody else want to offer anything? Ann, did you want to? Oh, sorry.
Sure, I'll add. I think, I'm really encouraged that our community is not sitting idly by. We're known for being innovative. We're known for being optimistic, and our community is putting their money where their mouth is. We're making significant investments in affordable housing, and there have been a lot of innovative collaborations. I'm really encouraged by what we've been able to do in Franklinton, and I want to see even more, and I'm hopeful that we will see even more collaborative private-public partnerships in creating more housing units for people in need.
Yeah, I think that collaborative spirit is what gives me a lot of hope too. We've seen time and again here in Central Ohio, when our community comes together, we're capable of transformative change, and I think this is no different. So lots of reason to be optimistic. I think the other reasons that were given already ditto those too. Lots of reasons to be optimistic.
I'm a planner by background, so the zoning code update gives me lots of optimism. It's the first time in 70 years that we'll be looking at a comprehensive look at our zoning code. And I think that speaks to our desire and really the initiative to take a look at our systems, programs, all of the ways in which we impact development across Central Ohio, and really modernize it and think about how we can look forward into the 21st century and what those systems need to look like. To create that equitable housing ecosystem where we have opportunities for families. And I think that's, the ability for us to take a look at that zoning code is going to be a really impactful process that we all get to go through, not just the city of Columbus, but the resources we'll be bringing to the table and sharing with our partners in the other jurisdictions and regionally. And I think that's really going to be a powerful conversation. Even though it's just about zoning, I think it's a sign of how we are moving forward into a more modern version of how we manage development and how we grow as a city.
Well, great. Well, thank you guys all so much for tuning in tonight. This was an important conversation. We could talk about this for another hour or three, probably. I didn't get through all the questions that I had. I know this conversation is going to continue in our Facebook chat. You can also chat with us in our community group that we came up with for the conversation page in the Dispatch. It's Columbus Dispatch Conversations on Facebook. Be sure to check that out. To support journalism like this, please subscribe to the Columbus Dispatch. Dispatch.com/subscribe now. You can actually get a deal right now. There's a sale going on. First, though, I want to thank our panel. Once again, we have Brian Higgins, who is principal of Arch City Development. We have Aaron Prosser, who is the City of Columbus's new Assistant Director for Housing Strategies. Noel Williams, who is BRED's Vice President and the Chair of the Families First and Housing Now. You have Jennifer Knoll, the Principal Planner with the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. Sydney Charles, who is the Chief Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity Officer for Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority. And finally, we have Ann Bischoff, who is the CEO of Start House. I'm Amelia Robinson. I want to thank the crew behind the scenes. We have Chandler and we have Joe. Please have a great night and continue the conversations in your own home and with those you encounter who care about housing. We all should, right? Have a good night.